The voice you hear at the beginning is from a courtroom news report, a reminder of how dark Rick James's world had already become long before his final day. A man is preparing to stand trial, accused of supplying drugs to a witness who helped send Rick to prison. Reporters repeat the story from a month earlier, when Rick and his girlfriend Tanya Hijazi were arrested, accused of holding a 4-year-old woman inside his Hollywood Hills home, allegedly burning her with a heated cocaine pipe and forcing her into sexual acts. They told us Rick James died of natural causes, a simple ending to a complicated life. But the second you examine his last 24 hours, nothing about that night feels natural at all. Not the unidentified woman neighbors saw running out of his apartment at 5:20 p.m., tears in her eyes and panic in her body language. Not the wooden box that had always sat in the same place, suddenly gone before investigators ever stepped inside. Not the 2 different glasses left on the table, even though the official account insisted he had been alone. And certainly not the autopsy that revealed 9 different substances inside his system, none of them at a level strong enough on its own to kill him. So, if the evidence in that apartment doesn't line up with the official story, what really happened behind the door of that Studio City unit? Who actually saw him alive for the last time? And why did a technician inside the coroner's office quietly admit that there was an earlier draft of the report, one that, according to reports, vanished without a trace? This investigation reconstructs the final 24 hours they never expected the public to question. The final hours that connect back to secrets Rick himself warned about when he once said, "If I die suddenly, don't believe it." To understand the darkness surrounding Rick James's final 24 hours, you have to rewind more than a decade back to the moment his body first began to fail while the world was still cheering for the legend he had built. The early 1,990 seconds were supposed to be his second golden run. He had survived the inferno of fame, stamped his name onto the sound of an entire era, and resisted temptations that would have destroyed most artists long before him. But as the new decade opened, something shifted. The chaos that once felt like fuel for his creativity stopped being thrilling and started becoming lethal. The unraveling became impossible to ignore. In the last days of October 1991, when Rick was arrested after accusations of violence involving Tanya Hijazi, a woman who would remain tightly bound to his story in the years that followed. If earlier scandals had been written off as wild chapters in a colorful life, this one was different. It triggered a full-scale legal storm. From that point forward, Rick entered a long era where courtrooms, attorneys, and tabloid headlines slowly replaced studios and stages. Legal summons kept arriving, dragging him through hearings that stretched from 1,993 into 1,995, grinding away at whatever peace he had left. While the media obsessed over the spectacle of his personal chaos, a harsher reality was unfolding in the background. In the few public appearances he managed, anyone really paying attention could see it. Rick looked exhausted in a way that makeup and sunglasses couldn't disguise. His eyes were sunken, his breathing shallow. There was a weight to his movements that no longer matched the super freak image the world still carried in its memory. Chest pains had already begun, but he brushed them off with the same excuse every time. "I'm just tired from working." The crisis became undeniable in 1998, when Rick was rushed into surgery after what doctors described as a minor stroke, a medical emergency that some of them would later call a dress rehearsal for something worse. Physicians warned him that the damage in his body was directly tied to years of cocaine, methamphetamine, and stimulant abuse that his system simply could no longer tolerate. One doctor looked him in the eye and issued a chilling prediction. If he kept using cocaine at that pace, he would not live another 10 years. It was the first major warning and maybe the clearest, but Rick treated it like it belonged to someone else. When he left the hospital, the public assumed he had finally learned his lesson. But behind closed doors, a different battle was beginning. The pain didn't vanish, it only changed form. During long nights in Studio City, he would roll back and forth in bed, clutching his chest as sharp bursts of pain tore through him. Friends later said that each morning, before he even stood up, he would sit perfectly still on the edge of the mattress, one hand pressed flat against his sternum, breathing slowly as if he had to negotiate with his own body just to start the day. Between 2000 and 2002, the chest pain stopped being an occasional warning and became a constant companion. Rick kept performing, kept dressing in glamorous outfits, kept pretending he was still untouchable, but the people closest to him saw what the audience couldn't. A Stone City Band technician remembered that Rick always carried a small pouch of powerful painkillers, and on especially stressful nights, he would quietly double his dose. By 2001, it was said that he had found a Beverly Hills doctor known for prescribing opioids to celebrities without asking too many questions. No one could prove it, but everyone noticed that Rick suddenly had pills no one recognized. It wasn't just bandmates who noticed the decline. A backstage worker later revealed that before almost every show, Rick would pause, lay his hand over the center of his chest, and close his eyes for several seconds, like a man afraid that one wrong move might cause his heart to explode. Rick never spoke openly about that fear. Instead, he began turning to a private journal. He didn't write every day, but when he did, the entries poured out pieces of the darkness he was carrying. Friends who later saw some of those pages described them as confessions the public would never have imagined. He wrote about nights without sleep, about a pressure building inside his chest, and about a strange dread he described as a shadow following me. In some entries, he mentioned a prophecy he had been told years earlier that 56 would be the limit of his life. No one seemed to know where that prediction came from, but as he crept closer to that age, Rick brought it up more and more, almost as if he were counting down to something he believed he couldn't escape. To the outside world, he was still the bold, defiant figure they remembered. But inside, a collapsing body was fighting a battle it was slowly losing every single day. From Los Angeles to Buffalo to Studio City, every place Rick lived during this period followed the same pattern. He arrived already tired, and he left even more drained. Some nights, he stayed in the studio long after everyone else had gone home, sitting alone and staring at the speakers as if he were trying to hear the rhythm of his own failing heartbeat. No one around him realized that these warning pains were early signs of one of the largest, most overworked hearts the Los Angeles coroner's office would ever examine. No one understood that during these exact years, Rick James's body was quietly sliding toward an irreversible collapse. And all of that leads to one chilling question, one that hangs over this entire investigation. Rick James understood that his body was abandoning him, but did he know what, or who, would ultimately push it past the point of no return? The sun rose slowly over Studio City on August 5, 2004. But inside the Oakwood Toluca Hills complex, the morning carried a strange weight. This wasn't just another late night followed by one of Rick James's lazy, hungover mornings. Something about the air in that building felt wrong, as if the day itself was holding its breath. Neighbors would later tell investigators that the night before had been unusually loud, even by Rick's standards. Music pounded through the walls long past midnight, heavy bass lines shaking picture frames. There were bursts of laughter, the thud of something falling over, and the kind of muffled chaos that suggested more people were inside the apartment than anyone would officially acknowledge later. But when morning finally arrived, all of that noise collapsed into a silence that felt too complete, too sudden, like someone had reached into the room and switched life off. Rick James did not wake early. In fact, he didn't stir until well after noon long, past the time he normally used to check in with his manager. When he finally did answer his phone, his first words weren't sarcastic, dramatic, or playful. They were words of pain. At around 11:15 a.m., when his manager reached him, Rick admitted something he had been hiding for years. A sharp, burning pain in his chest and a numbness running down his left arm. Classic warning signs that most people would treat as an emergency. Signs that send other people straight to 911. Rick delivered them like a man reporting the weather. He tried to laugh it off, but the manager would later recall that his voice sounded thin and strained, like someone trying hard not to let panic show. Even with his body practically shouting for help, Rick did what he had always done. He slipped back into old patterns. Shortly after 1:40 p.m., he made a call to a longtime friend from his Motown years. This wasn't just any acquaintance. According to rumors that had circulated quietly for decades, this friend had once been a source of certain relaxing substances that Rick used when he wanted to dull the pain without completely losing control. The request Rick made that afternoon was brief and cryptic. "Bring me something light," he said. "Something to take the edge off." No one knows exactly what light meant that day. The man he called refused to speak to investigators, and his name never appeared in any official document. But several people in Rick's circle later claimed they immediately suspected what had been delivered to that apartment. Around 3 p.m., food arrived at Rick's door. The delivery driver later told police that when Rick cracked the door open, he looked tired, but otherwise calm. No obvious panic, no visible chaos. Rick thanked him quickly, took the bag, and shut the door almost immediately. He barely ate any of it. When investigators later examined the scene, the plate was found nearly untouched, as if the act of eating had demanded more energy than he could spare. Friends would later insist this was not like Rick at all. He loved food, especially indulgent late-night meals. For him to ignore a plate like that suggested something inside his body was dragging him down, heavier than simple fatigue. Then came the moment that still haunts the timeline. The unidentified woman. At exactly 5:20 p.m., witnesses saw a young woman leaving Rick's apartment. She moved quickly, almost at a run. She wasn't dressed like someone who had planned to stay overnight. Simple, casual clothes, sunglasses pushed back on her head. But what people remembered most wasn't what she wore. It was the way she moved. One neighbor said she looked shaken, her eyes red as if she had been crying. Another claimed the woman kept glancing back at Rick's door, like someone afraid of what or who might follow her out. Yet, for all the fear etched on her face, no one ever identified her. Her name never appeared in any police report. She was never interviewed on record. In the official version of events, she might as well have never existed. While her identity disappeared, Rick's body continued to fail. Less than 2 hours later, around 7:15 p.m., Rick spoke with someone else on the phone. This time, his condition sounded worse. He was breathing heavily, pausing between phrases like each word cost him effort. "My heart ain't right," he said. "Something's wrong in there." The friend begged him to get help, to call a doctor, call an ambulance, call anyone. But Rick waved it off the way he always had, blaming exhaustion, strain, stress. Even so, the friend later recalled hearing something he had never heard from Rick before. Real fear. Not bravado, not dark humor. Fear. By 9:02 p.m., Rick sent what would become his final text message. "I'm tired. I'm just going to sleep." No jokes, no wild commentary, no dramatic exit line. Just a flat, simple message from a man whose body seemed to have finally dragged him past the point of pretending. And then, sometime after that text, the night swallowed him. After 11 p.m., the timeline dissolves into shadows and speculation. No neighbor reported hearing Rick's usual late-night music, the playlists that often shook the building when he couldn't sleep. No one saw lights flick on or off. The hallways stayed quiet. But according to whispers that spread in the days following his death, there may have been one final, unconfirmed visitor. Some people claim that someone showed up at his apartment sometime after 10:30 p.m. This mysterious visitor was never named in any official document, never interviewed on record, never logged by any camera. The Oakwood Toluca Hills building didn't have hallway surveillance at the time, which meant there was no footage to prove or disprove whether anyone came through Rick's door in those final hours. Still, the rumor refused to die. It circulated first among musicians from Rick's old circle, then slid quietly through conversations between studio techs, managers, and former girlfriends. Someone, they said, someone whose identity was deliberately kept away from paperwork, might have been the last person to see Rick James alive. And if that someone brought anything with them, pills, powders, light things, as Rick had requested earlier, those substances might have collided with his failing heart in ways no one could predict. Investigators never confirmed this late-night visit. The official report never acknowledged it. But the gaps in the timeline left behind a chilling question. If Rick truly spent that night alone, why was the apartment found in slight disarray? Why were there 2 different drink glasses on the table, each with its own pattern of condensation and lip marks, when the report insisted he had no one with him? Why did one close friend insist that during their last phone call, Rick sounded like he had company in the room? None of those details appeared in the final paperwork. What happened after 11 p.m. remains locked inside the silence of a room that would, by the next morning, be labeled a death scene. Maybe Rick really did fall asleep as soon as he hung up the phone. Maybe he reached for something on the table beside him. Maybe he got up one last time and never made it back to the sofa. Or maybe someone else was there, watching as a heart that had been ticking toward disaster for years finally crossed the threshold. We are left with a neat chain of times on a cold timeline, each one marking a step toward the moment his pulse stopped. 11:15 a.m. Pain. 1:40 p.m. Something light. 3 p.m. Food delivered, barely touched. 5:20 p.m. The fleeing woman. 7:15 p.m. My heart ain't right. 9:02 p.m. Final message. After 11 p.m., the void. And inside that void lies the most important question of all. Who was the last person in that apartment? And what did they bring through Rick James's door? Comfort, escape, or something deadly? Morning crept quietly over Studio City on August 6, 2004. The sun was already high, the valley heat settling early over the streets and palm trees. But inside the Oakwood Toluca Hills complex, something felt wrong. The air in the hallway outside Rick James's door had the heavy stillness of a conversation cut short. Rick had promised his manager he would call early that day, a routine check-in he kept, even when he was exhausted, even when he wasn't feeling like himself. By 9:30 a.m., the call still hadn't come. Text messages sat unanswered. At first, his manager didn't panic. Rick was unpredictable. Maybe he'd slept late. Maybe he was ignoring his phone. But the longer the silence stretched, the more that uneasy feeling from the night before began to tighten like a knot in the back of his mind. When the housekeeper arrived at Rick's apartment a short time later, she sensed that same wrongness almost instantly. The hallway was too quiet. The usual trace of music or TV leaking under the door was missing. The thin line of light around the frame showed his lights were still on. She knocked softly at first. No response. She knocked again, louder. Still nothing. On the third knock, she pressed her ear to the door. There was no sound inside, no movement, no footsteps, no shifting fabric, no TV chatter, no sign of the man whose life usually sounded like a never-ending soundtrack. Using her spare key, she eased the door open at exactly 9:48 a.m. What she saw in those first seconds would later be described as deeply disturbing, though she struggled to find precise words for it. Rick James was lying on his right side on the floor, only inches from the sofa, as if he had slipped off the edge or collapsed while trying to stand. His legs were slightly bent. One arm was pinned awkwardly beneath him. The other stretched out, twisted just enough to look unnatural, as though the fall had caught him mid-motion. What struck the housekeeper first wasn't the position of his body. It was the stillness. Not the heavy sleep of a man drained from a long night, but a stillness that felt final, absolute. The television was still on, casting a soft, flickering glow across the room. Some syndicated rerun had flowed into an early morning broadcast, the volume turned down just enough to sink into the silence instead of breaking it. The apartment smelled faintly of old cigarette smoke and something sharp and bitter, maybe alcohol, maybe medication, maybe both. The blinds were half drawn, which bathed the room in a dim, muted light that made everything look slightly unreal, like a set from a movie where no one had remembered to call cut. The mess, too, felt different. Rick could be messy, everyone knew that. But this wasn't the usual creative chaos. Pill bottles were scattered across the coffee table. Shoes lay kicked in different directions. A blanket hung half off the sofa, dragged toward the floor, like someone had been reaching for it, or trying to rise and didn't make it. Closest to him, within arm's reach, were 4 different types of prescription medication. Later, investigators would say the mix included sedatives, painkillers, and anti-anxiety drugs. But the way they were arranged raised more questions than answers. Some bottles were uncapped, some were open. One lay on its side, as if knocked over in a hurry. And then there were the details that never appeared in the official report. The details that the housekeeper and manager noticed immediately and never forgot. Under a small table near the sofa, a wine glass had shattered. The stem was still intact, but the bowl had broken in two, jagged pieces catching the dim light like fragments of ice. Strangely, this glass would never be mentioned in the coroner's summary. No note, no photograph listed, no theory about how or when it broke. Officially, on paper, it was as if that glass had never been there at all. On the coffee table sat two other glasses. Two distinct lip marks, two separate rings of condensation. One glass half empty, the other almost untouched. The kind of small, ordinary detail that quietly suggested there had been two people drinking there, not one. But the report would later state that Rick James had spent the night alone. The manager arrived soon after receiving the frantic call. Stepping into the apartment, he froze. The sight of Rick on the floor was something he would say haunted him more than any headline ever could. But his eyes were pulled to something else almost immediately, a small gap on the shelf near the dining area. The wooden box was gone. It was a small, dark lock-top container Rick always kept in that exact spot. He used it for his special prescriptions, the medications he didn't want, lying around in plain sight. Friends said it was as much a ritual as a habit. The box was always there. Always. Until that morning. Now, the space where it sat was empty. The box was never recovered, never explained. It disappeared from Rick's apartment the same night Rick did. Officials called his death sudden cardiac failure, a failing heart, a long history of drug use. To them, the story wrote itself. But the people who truly knew him weren't satisfied. They knew Rick had abused drugs. They knew he pushed his limits. But when the toxicology report revealed 9 substances in his system, 9, they recoiled. Cocaine, meth, opioids, sedatives, THC, too many things at once. Friends and musicians who had shared his wildest nights insisted they had never seen him mix that many chemicals in one go. Rick could be reckless, they said, but he wasn't suicidal. That's when a darker question began to spread, quietly at first, then in growing whispers throughout studios, green rooms, and memorial gatherings. Who gave him all of that? And just as important, did he actually take all of it himself? The rumor that took hold was the most chilling version. Some people believed that someone had given Rick a combination too powerful for his battered heart to handle. Maybe by accident, maybe in ignorance, maybe with intention. But no one could prove it, and no one stepped forward. Other, smaller inconsistencies only deepened the suspicion. There was a bruise near his right shoulder that didn't fully match the simple story of a man collapsing gently from a sofa to the floor. There were faint scratches on his forearm that no one could explain, too light to indicate a fight, but strange enough to raise questions about what, or who, he might have brushed against in his final moments. Pieces of furniture looked slightly out of place, shifted just enough that only someone who knew the apartment well would notice. Nothing dramatic, nothing that screamed struggle, just subtle, unnerving rearrangements. Faced with a scene that lacked obvious signs of a crime, no forced entry, no clear violence, police chose the simplest narrative. Rick James, they concluded, died alone. His damaged heart, worn down by years of abuse and anchored by 9 substances, had finally given out. Case closed. But in the funk community, where stories and suspicions travel faster than official statements, people kept talking. They talked about the young woman seen rushing out of his apartment hours before his body was discovered. They talked about the rumored visitor sometime after 10:30 p.m., the one never listed in any report, protected by the absence of hallway cameras. They talked about the missing wooden box that had been a permanent fixture in his life, gone in the same breath as he was. They talked about the 2 glasses on the table, the shattered one beneath the side table, the medication layout that didn't quite match Rick's usual patterns. The discovery of Rick James's body should have brought closure. Instead, it opened a door into something murkier, a room full of missing pieces and quiet contradictions. So the questions only grew darker. Who was the last person truly present in that apartment? Why did they leave no trace anyone was willing to acknowledge? And if Rick collapsed so suddenly that he had no time to brace himself, what exactly pushed his failing heart over the edge that night? The official report ended the story. But the room where he was found told a different one, one built from silence, omissions, and shadows that, even now, have refused to step fully into the light. When Rick James's body arrived at the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office on August 9, 2004, no one there expected the case to become complicated. On paper, it looked routine. A man with a long history of drug use, chronic illness, and a badly damaged heart, found dead alone in his apartment. The assumption was simple: another musician whose body finally surrendered. It should have been straightforward. But once the examination began, it became clear that Rick's body carried a story far more tangled than anyone anticipated. And the deeper the coroner's team dug, the more that story seemed to resist being told in full. The autopsy didn't wrap in a single shift. It took days, not hours. Rick's medical history alone filled pages: years of cocaine abuse, past strokes, escalating heart problems, on-stage injuries, old scars layered under fresher ones. His organs showed what happens to a person who burns too hot, too fast, for far too long. But the true turning point came when the toxicology results started to come, in the moment when rumor and evidence collided, and none of the expected answers showed up. Rick's blood read like chaos. 9 different substances flowed through his system: cocaine, diazepam, alprazolam, Wellbutrin, Valium, methamphetamine, Vicodin, Xanax, and THC. 9. For anyone hearing that list for the first time, the conclusion seemed obvious: an overdose, a lethal cocktail, a death by excess. But coroners are trained not just to read the list, but to read the levels. And that's where everything stopped making sense. The cocaine and methamphetamine, the very substances most likely to slam a heart into sudden failure, weren't present in the kinds of amounts that normally kill quickly. They were there, yes, but at levels far below what would be expected in a classic overdose. Several other substances were at therapeutic or near therapeutic levels, the sort of amounts you'd see in someone using them as prescribed. Others were low enough to suggest they had been taken earlier, not right before he died. His body didn't look like that of a man who had taken everything in one reckless binge. It looked like a system that had been carrying multiple medications, layered over time, and then suddenly tipped into crisis. Then there was the heart. Rick's heart weighed about 1.75 pounds, nearly double the weight of a typical adult male heart. It was swollen, stretched, and thickened from years of stimulant abuse and chronic high blood pressure. The chambers were enlarged. The muscle wall was heavy, dense. Blood vessels showed scarring that had been building for years, like rings on a tree, recording every bad decision. A heart like that was a ticking clock. Everyone in that room knew it. But even so, it didn't resemble the typical heart of a man felled by one catastrophic overdose. It looked more like the end result of a long siege, a heart that had been pushed and punished until it needed only the smallest nudge to fail. One forensic technician later described Rick's heart as looking like it had been under siege for years. Not blasted apart, not freshly poisoned, but worn down, battered, exhausted. The heart of someone whose body had carried too much damage for far too long. And yet, that same technician allegedly insisted there was something off about the pattern of stress, something subtle that didn't match what they usually saw in deaths, driven primarily by a sudden, overwhelming dose of drugs. The toxicology didn't perfectly align with the damage. The heart didn't quite align with the levels. The way his body shut down didn't fully align with the story of one fatal hit. That's when the rumor began. Inside the coroner's office, whispers started about an early draft of the autopsy report, the version written before edits, before signatures, before lawyers and officials got involved. According to those whispers, that first draft suggested that Rick James died from drug-facilitated cardiac arrest. 3 words that changed the entire frame. Drug-facilitated cardiac arrest. Not killed outright by drugs, but pushed by them. A phrase that implied the substances in his system didn't directly stop his heart, but helped something else do it. A phrase that hinted at a trigger, something new, something added, something unexpected that nudged an already failing heart over the edge. And then, as quickly as that language reportedly appeared, it vanished. Some staff claimed the draft had been revised. Others insisted such a version never officially existed. The only document the public would ever see was the final report, which made no mention of facilitation, suspicion, timing, or interaction. Instead, it offered a clean, simple conclusion. Rick James died from cardiac failure. Accidental, unintentional, unremarkable, another musician whose long-term drug use and bad habits caught up with him, another file to close. But that clean version of the story never addressed the contradictions. If the cocaine levels were too low to kill him, if the methamphetamine levels were nowhere near fatal, if the sedatives were within therapeutic or near therapeutic ranges, if his heart showed the scars of long-term stress rather than sudden chemical trauma, then what, exactly, made his heart stop at that precise time, on that particular night, in that silent apartment? The timeline didn't make things any easier to explain. Rick had been conscious and coherent hours before his death. He had enough clarity to text, to talk, to ask for something light to ease his pain. He expressed fear. He described chest pain. He knew something was wrong in there. Yet, by the time his body was found, he was on the floor, inches from the sofa, with no sign that he had fought, crawled, or reached out for help in those final seconds. The substances in his system did not paint the picture of a man deliberately chasing oblivion. They painted the image of someone trying to manage chronic pain and anxiety, someone who had fallen into the dangerous, familiar pattern of mixing medications he shouldn't have, but not in obviously suicidal quantities. Then there was the missing wooden box, the one he used for his private prescriptions, the ones he didn't leave lying around. That box was gone before investigators arrived. The pills near his body didn't match the full list of medications people believed he kept inside that container. Some of what should have been there wasn't. Some of what was there didn't quite belong. There were 2 glasses on the table, both with fresh lip marks. A third glass shattered under the small table, a bruise on his shoulder, a scratch on his arm no one bothered to track. 9 substances in his system, none individually at a lethal level, all swirling together inside a heart that had been pushed beyond its limit for years. The scene felt less like a clean overdose and more like something assembled small pieces stacking into something deadly. Behind closed doors, technicians and staff reportedly disagreed. Some believed the simplest explanation: the heart just gave out. Others argued that a combination of small doses layered on top of exhaustion, fear, and chronic damage triggered a fatal arrhythmia. But a third group whispered something darker. They suggested that someone might have given Rick a drug he wasn't familiar with, or slipped something into his light request earlier in the day, or handed him a pill he accepted without question. Those whispers only grew louder when people noticed how long the autopsy took, how the rumored draft report disappeared, how certain inconsistencies were ignored, and how the final language felt more like an effort to shut down questions than to answer them. Even now, one question hangs over everything, like smoke in a sealed room. If the drugs alone weren't enough to kill him, what or who gave Rick James the final push? The autopsy was supposed to close the book. The coroner's report was meant to offer a clean, clinical ending to Rick James's story. A ruined heart, worn down by years of abuse, finally giving out. A tragic, predictable conclusion to a reckless life. But instead of resolving the mystery, the examination only opened new doors. Doors that led into shadows most people were not ready to walk into. The questions didn't fade. They multiplied. They spread quietly through studios, hotel bars, rehearsal rooms, and family kitchens. And as those questions grew stronger, something else started to happen. The answers began to disappear. To understand what came next, you have to look closely at the days immediately after the autopsy results became public. Reports summarized the findings in a few cold lines. Cardiac failure, multiple substances in the bloodstream, accidental death. The tone was blunt and dismissive. Case closed. Nothing more to see. But the people who truly knew Rick didn't buy that simplicity. Not his bandmates, not his relatives, not the technicians who had watched his body opened on the coroner's table, and certainly not the ones who remembered the missing wooden box, the broken glass, and the unnamed visitor who vanished from the story as if erased. The silence around those inconsistencies didn't feel random. It felt deliberate. At first, the cover-up looked like nothing more than omissions. tiny absences, details that were strangely absent from official documents, evidence that seemed to evaporate between the apartment and the final report. But the deeper friends and colleagues looked, the more it felt as if someone had run a thick black marker through the story, crossing out anything that could raise suspicion. One of the earliest red flags came from inside the coroner's own building. A forensic technician who had been present during the examination of Rick's heart quietly told a longtime Motown employee that the heart damage simply didn't look like the result of a sudden overdose. Not even close. "This wasn't an explosion," he reportedly said. "This was torture over years." The implication was clear. The drugs inside Rick's body didn't match the picture of a heart that had just been blown apart by one massive, reckless hit. Even more troubling was the rumor that began circulating days later. Some staff whispered about a draft autopsy report that allegedly included the phrase, "drug-facilitated cardiac arrest," a phrase that pointed not just to long-term abuse, but to some external trigger, a combination, a catalyst. According to the rumor, that draft quietly vanished, replaced by the sanitized version the public eventually saw. No one from the coroner's office publicly confirmed it, but no one strongly denied it either. Meanwhile, people around Rick began to notice something else, another pattern that felt too coordinated to be coincidence. Individuals who had seen or heard something on Rick's final day suddenly stopped talking. The delivery driver, who had described seeing Rick the afternoon before his death, refused further interviews. A neighbor who once insisted she heard two male voices arguing in the hallway sometime after 11 p.m. later backed away from her story, claiming she must have been mistaken. And the woman seen fleeing his apartment at 5:20 p.m., the one with red eyes and hurried steps, never came forward. Her name never surfaced publicly. Officially, she might as well have been a hallucination. So why did everyone suddenly fall silent? That question leads straight into the darkest corner of this entire story. Because silence, especially in Los Angeles, is its own language. And that language usually means someone is protecting something or someone with real power. To see the full picture, you have to look at Rick's life in the weeks leading up to his death. Despite the pain, despite the declining health, Rick was planning a return creatively and personally. He was writing again, recording again, and more importantly, he was talking. Not in front of cameras, but in long late-night conversations with old friends. He was angry at Motown, angry at decades of exploitation, angry at financial deals that had left him drained while others profited off his work. According to people close to him, Rick was no longer content with just complaining. He was considering legal action moves that could have forced certain labels and executives to revisit old royalty agreements. And Rick James wasn't just another artist with a grudge. He had documentation, contracts, notes, stories. He knew who had done what and when. He knew which executives stayed clean in public and which ones didn't. He knew who used drugs, who supplied them, who funded them, and who buried the evidence when things went bad. One veteran manager put it simply, Rick carried secrets like ammunition, and when he hurt, he threatened to use them. If he had gone forward with legal action, if he had decided to unload everything he knew, reputations could have crumbled. Millions of dollars could have shifted. Careers could have ended. So when he died suddenly, quietly, in a way that left more questions than answers, it wasn't just tragic. For some people, it was convenient. But the darkest theory didn't come from industry executives. It came from inside Rick's own circle. One of his closest friends described a conversation that took place 3 weeks before Rick's death. They were sitting together late at night, Rick clutching his chest, breathing through another wave of pain. And then, in a tone that hovered between a joke and a confession, Rick said, "If I go out suddenly, don't trust the story they tell you." Those words replayed again and again in his friend's mind afterward, because the official story didn't match the scene. It didn't match Rick's behavior in his final hours. It didn't match the strange details at the apartment. And it certainly didn't match the presence of 9 substances in his system, some of which he rarely used unless someone else put them in his hand. Then there was the missing wooden box, the 2 glasses on the table, the shattered one on the floor, the unexplained bruise on his shoulder, the faint scratch on his forearm, the neighbor who said she heard footsteps close to midnight. taken alone, each detail might be dismissed. Together they pointed toward one chilling possibility. Rick James wasn't alone when he died. But the question no one wanted to speak aloud was even darker. Was someone simply with him, or was someone sent to him? Inside the funk community, the whispers sharpened. Someone gave him too much. Someone wanted him quiet. He didn't mix all that on his own. He trusted the wrong person. Yet every one of those theories crashed into the same wall. There were no cameras, no signed statements, no one willing to go on record. It was as if someone had walked through the final hours of Rick's life with gloves on, wiping down the story as they went. And that is what makes the idea of a cover-up feel so unsettling. Not because it proves guilt, but because it seems designed to erase the path to the truth. Someone didn't just avoid answering questions. They made sure many of those questions could never be asked properly in the first place. So where does that leave us? It leaves us staring at a timeline full of fractures, a death scene full of missing elements, a man whose heart was failing. Yes, but failing gradually, predictably, not explosively. A toxicology report that didn't quite match the man his friends described. And a community that, even now, feels deep in its bones that something about Rick James's final night was not natural, not entirely accidental, and not completely under his control. Rick's body was buried. The report was filed. The headlines moved on, but the truth, the real truth, seemed to slip out the back door the same night he did. The autopsy should have ended the mystery. Instead, it opened the darkest chapter of all. In the days following Rick James's death, something eerie unfolded across Hollywood, Motown circles, and even within his own family. It was sharper than grief and louder than silence. People weren't just mourning. They were unsettled, jumpy, guarded, speaking in lowered voices. What struck those closest to the case was how quickly that tension appeared. It was as if Rick's death didn't just mark the end of one man's life. It marked the beginning of a cover-up. The first hint came from a former girlfriend who had been with Rick through some of his worst spirals. She told friends that Rick had been preparing to write a memoir, not a glossy, airbrushed rock autobiography, but a true one. A book with names, dates, dollar amounts, betrayals, drug networks, stolen royalties, and detailed accounts of how the industry bled artists dry behind the scenes. According to her, Rick was finished protecting people. "If I talk," he once told her, "they'll beg me to shut up." She said he had already started outlining chapters. He wasn't shy about who he planned to expose. Then came an even more explosive claim. A member of the Stone City Band said Rick had been secretly recording conversations with major artists and executives for years. These weren't harmless messages or playful studio clips. They were hours of audio capturing deals that shouldn't have been made, favors that weren't clean, confessions no one expected to be heard again. Rick kept these tapes as protection, a shield, in case anyone tried to bury him, financially or physically. When he died, those recordings vanished. No one has ever produced them. No one has admitted to having them. They were simply gone. While the public grieved, a very different script was playing out behind the scenes. Reporters who tried to investigate the mysterious woman seen leaving Rick's apartment at 5:20 p.m. reported being quietly discouraged. Some were told the lead wasn't relevant. Others were told off the record to avoid putting her name into print if they ever discovered it. No one ever made it clear who issued those warnings. No one explained why a key figure in the final day timeline should be considered unimportant. It was as though someone wanted her erased from the narrative just as completely as the missing tapes. As shock turned into uneasy acceptance, the rumors began to crystallize into distinct theories. The first rumor said that Rick had been given something far stronger than he expected by someone settling an old score. The suggestion was that he trusted the wrong person, took the wrong pill, swallowed the wrong dose. Maybe a tragic miscalculation, maybe deliberate. But either way, the result was the same. The second rumor pointed upward to a record label, or people connected to one, who feared what might happen if Rick reopened his old royalty agreements. If he filed the lawsuit people said he was considering, he might have dragged millions of dollars and buried secrets into the light. For certain people, his sudden death came at a very convenient moment. The third rumor turned inward, toward home. It focused on the possibility of a family member with a financial motive. Rick's estate was valuable, and some people close to him whispered that certain relatives were uneasy about changes he intended to make to his will. A wealthy man, fragile health, shifting loyalties, ingredients that can attract dangerous attention from those who depend on his name to survive. Then there was the fourth rumor, the one that unsettled even those who didn't believe in conspiracy. According to this story, the woman who fled the apartment at 5:20 p.m. may have returned after 10:30 p.m. If that is true, she would have been present during the missing hours, the very period when Rick's condition shifted from distress to silence. If she did come back, why was that second visit never mentioned? Who decided that her possible return did not belong in the official story? As if all of that wasn't enough, Rick himself had left behind one more chilling clue. 3 weeks before he died, during one of his late-night episodes of chest pain, he leaned forward and spoke to a close friend. This time, the wording was even more direct. "If I die suddenly," he said, "don't think it's random. Someone wants me quiet." At the time, the friend brushed it off as dramatic talk from a man in pain. But after Rick's death, those words landed differently, because suddenly, the circumstances of his final night didn't feel random at all. The missing wooden box, the 2 glasses on the table, the broken one on the floor, the scratches that didn't fit a simple fall, the 9 substances he almost never mixed himself, the woman who vanished from the timeline, the rumored late visitor, the sudden silence from everyone who might have known more. Piece by piece, what should have been a clear story became murky. The truth didn't just blur, it receded. The silence surrounding Rick's final hours grew so thick that even those who loved him most had trouble separating fact from fear. Some people believed he was simply a man whose body finally gave out. Others whispered about motives, personal, financial, professional, that might have made his death beneficial, not just tragic. And still others believed Rick died exactly the way he predicted, not just from a failing heart, but from a world that decided his voice was too dangerous to leave alive. The official report labeled his death accidental and closed the file. But nearly 2 decades later, nothing about the story feels finished. It feels jagged, deliberately incomplete. Because if Rick James truly died from heart failure alone, why do so many details fight against that narrative? Why do so many people refuse to talk about that night? Why does the timeline fracture precisely at the moment when the truth becomes most important? So the question is no longer just, what happened to Rick James? The real question is, why is the truth still missing? Did Rick die because his heart had reached its natural end, or because his secrets pushed the wrong people to the edge? Did the silence in his apartment come from fate or from fear? And maybe the most haunting question of all, who was the final person to walk through Rick James's door that night, and why have they never stepped forward? Tell me what you think. Tell me which theory makes the most sense. Because somewhere between the hard